We're going to begin with talking a little bit of background information in order to understand those processes, and then start getting into respiration. In subsequent videos, we'll go into the details of photosynthesis. So when we're talking about metabolism, we're really talking about energy production. So how do the organisms get energy? What do they do with the food they eat to create energy? And what are the processes along the path to that? Now, when we're talking about energy in living organisms, we are mostly talking about ATP, or what's called adenosine triphosphate. And what that is it's a molecule that contains 3 different phosphates attached to it. So you can see down here, you have adenine attached to a ribose sugar, and you have 1, 2, 3 phosphate groups. Now, in molecules, there is energy within the bonds between different atoms. And so this terminal phosphate group here, this last phosphate group, has a lot of energy in its bond to the other 2 phosphate groups. And so when we're using ATP, which is we're going to call the currency of the cell, it's what the cells will use to pay for some process. If you want to pump some molecule across the membrane, you're going to give it some ATP in order to do that. It's just like you would give $5 or whatever to have your car washed. It's the same idea here, except we're using a chemical energy source as the currency. And so with ATP, when we want to use that energy, we will break the bond between this terminal phosphate group and the remaining, what we call ADP, adenosine diphosphate, to extract the energy from that chemical bond. So we have ATP here, we break it, so we get a phosphate and then ADP and a release of energy. That energy release is what we can use to perform a bunch of physiological functions. And so as we're going through cellular respiration and photosynthesis, I'm going to be saying ATP quite a bit. Keep in mind that means you're creating something to transfer energy that you can use at a later point. You can kind of think about it as like a battery. You're going to charge it up, move the battery somewhere else, and then use the energy from that battery to power something. Now, for cellular respiration, the mitochondria are really the key to that. Mitochondria, you probably heard, are the powerhouse of the cell. What that means, the term powerhouse there is referring to the fact that they are ATP manufacturers. They're going to produce a lot of ATP. Therefore, they're powering the cell by creating that, right? And when we look at a mitochondria, you can see it has an outer membrane that's like what looks like a capsule of some sort here, and an inner membrane, just like really convoluted membrane on the inside, which means we have an outer membrane, a space between 2 membranes, an inner membrane, and the mitochondrial matrix, which is the inside of that second membrane. And different processes will happen at different parts of the mitochondria. So it's important to keep track of where cellular respiration processes are happening relative to the anatomy of a mitochondria, because it becomes very important. So cellular respiration, the goal of cellular respiration is to make energy that you can use for other functions. And the energy here will be ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Now here's the general formula for cellular respiration, and it mirrors our body as a whole. So we take in food, we eat food, we use that for energy. The food in the cellular respiration formula here is C6H12O6. That's glucose. Carbohydrates, they might have a slide for it, have a ratio of 1:1. 1 carbon, 2 hydrogens, 1 oxygen. If you see in glucose here, it has C6H12O6, 1:1. That tells you that it's a carbohydrate. So we're going to eat food, use that glucose to throw into cellular respiration for energy production. We breathe in oxygen. We breathe in oxygen for cellular respiration. And we'll talk about where oxygen comes in and why it's key to the cellular respiration process. And then as a result of cellular respiration, we make carbon dioxide. It's a waste product. We want to get rid of it. We also make water. Now, water here is a byproduct, meaning it's good for us. It's good that we get water. It's not enough to keep us alive. We still have to drink water, but it's useful still. Some animals can live off water just through cellular respiration. They never have to drink water at all. Plants obviously get most of their water through their roots, but they do generate some water through cellular respiration. And then, of course, the goal, ATP, the energy production. Now, keep that in mind. We talked about cellular respiration using us as an analogy there, right? So we eat food, we breathe in oxygen, we exhale CO2, and we make water, right? The plant respiratory system is the same, mirrors mostly the same process, except for the fact that photosynthesis is producing oxygen as well and taking in CO2. Now, for plant respiration, we're going to be mostly talking about how air gets in and out of the plant, primarily at the leaves. It can happen through the stems and stuff, especially through little breaks inside the epidermis or peridermis layer, right? But mostly we're talking about the leaves. And so the big barrier, remember, to things moving in and out of the leaf is the cuticle, because it's that lipid layer that blocks diffusion of most substances in and out of it. And so leaves have stoma or stomata, right? The two guard cells that open up and expose a pore that allows things to diffuse in and out of the leaf. So you have the stomata right here, and oxygen can diffuse in, CO2 can diffuse in, both can diffuse out, and water can diffuse in and out. So when we're talking about like the plant respiratory system, we're really talking about the movement of air in and out of that stomata. Now, it gets a little bit more complicated when we add photosynthesis in there, but the same idea is happening with us, right? We breathe in oxygen, we breathe out CO2 through our lungs. They're doing that through their stomata and natural diffusion in and out of the mesophyll cells. Okay, for cellular respiration, this is a very cursory overlook of cellular respiration because it's an intro class. I don't want to go too in detail for it. But you do need to know the major hits here. And I'm going to describe it basically in the level that you will need to know. So you'll see that I'll jump over a lot of pieces of it. But know it in the level that I described in the video here. So there's 4 steps. There's glycolysis. There's the transition reaction, also called pyruvate oxidation, citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. Now, glycolysis happens completely external of the mitochondria. It has nothing to do with the mitochondria at all. It's going to happen in the cytosol, or cytoplasm of the cell. The other 3 are going to happen in the mitochondria. So glycolysis is the first step. And the way this will work throughout basically these first 3 steps is going to be take glucose, break the carbons, and as you break the carbons, extract energy. As you're breaking those chemical bonds of carbon, store the energy. So break the bond, store the energy. Break the bond, store the energy. Break the bond, store the energy. And then the electron transport chain is really going to be take that stored energy and turn it into ATP. And so keep that in mind as we kind of move through this. So glycolysis really means break down glucose. Break the glucose down into parts. So here we have glucose, and it gets broken down into 2 different molecules. So you basically kind of split it in half. And those molecules are called pyruvate. So 1 glucose goes to 2 pyruvate. And as you break those bonds, you're going to create ATP and another thing called NADH. So you have to use 2 ATP to do this process, to break the glucose, but you make 4. So you get a net production of ATP from glycolysis of 2. So 2 ATP molecules per glucose. You also make 2 NADH. And these are just high energy electron carriers, meaning they're going to take electrons and transfer them somewhere else. So we have 2 ATP and 2 NADH net production, right? So glycolysis goes to 2 pyruvate plus 2 ATP plus 2 NADH. And we're going to take these and we're going to use these later on. Okay, so glycolysis, remember I said, is happening out here in the cytosol. We're going to switch now to the transition reaction, which is going to happen, the transition reaction and the citric acid cycle will happen within the inner mitochondrial matrix. And then the electron transport chain will happen at the membrane of the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Okay, so pyruvate oxidation or the transition reaction. Again, break the carbon, store the energy. So glycolysis went glucose to pyruvate, ATP plus NADH. We take those pyruvates, we move them into the mitochondria, so through 2 different membranes, so now they're in the mitochondrial matrix. And we convert them to acetyl-CoA. So another molecule called acetyl-CoA. Now with that, we also produce an NADH and a CO2 molecule. So now we have multiple NADH from different steps. So one NADH per pyruvate, so 2 NADH total, plus CO2, one each, so two CO2 total. And then we're going to go to the citric acid cycle. So this is where you're breaking more carbon and extracting more energy. So just to recap, glucose to pyruvate plus 2 ATP plus 2 NADH. Pyruvate inside the mitochondria to acetyl-CoA plus 2 NADH and 2 CO2. We are then going to take this acetyl-CoA and put it through the citric acid cycle. And it's just a ring of chemical reactions that's going to occur. There's a lot of steps to it. You don't need to know the steps of the citric acid cycle. Hence why I used just a blank circle here. Just to illustrate that it is a cycle that's occurring, you don't have to know the steps to it. You need to know the inputs and the outputs of it though. So you take acetyl-CoA. Remember we have two of them because we had one glucose to 2 pyruvate. So 2 pyruvates here, each one makes acetyl-CoA, so we have 2 acetyl-CoAs. So for every glucose molecule, you get 2 rotations around the citric acid cycle. So that acetyl-CoA enters the citric acid cycle here, goes around it, and as a result, it's going to make 2 ATP, so 1 ATP per acetyl-CoA, 6 NADH, 3 per acetyl-CoA, 2 FADH2s, which are just another high energy electron carrier like NADH. So you get 2 of those, 1 per acetyl-CoA, and 2 CO2, 4 CO2, 2 per acetyl-CoA. So overall, you get quite a bit of production out of the citric acid cycle. So it's a pretty useful chemical cascade that's producing a lot of energy. Either energy in the form of ATP or high energy electron carriers that we're going to use later on to make more ATP. Now when we're talking about CO2, remember we're going to exhale CO2. Plants are going to do that as well. And so we're exhaling a lot of CO2 from the pyruvate oxidation and from the citric acid cycle. 2 big producers of CO2 that we're exhaling. Okay, now here's the big step, the electron transport chain. This is where we're going to make most of our energy. Most of the other steps are going to try and get us to the electron transport chain. This is the step that's really beneficial to aerobic organisms, organisms that are using oxygen. Now, this electron transport chain, and there's going to be electron transport chains in photosynthesis as well, is basically a cascade that's going to occur across the membrane to try and make some system, usually of diffusion, to occur that you can then use that diffusion gradient to create ATP. Now, keep in mind, we've not made very much ATP here. We made 2 here, 1 per acetyl-CoA and 2 in glycolysis. So not very much, maybe about 4 ATP so far. This one step makes about 32 ATP. So overall, we're getting about 36, with 32 of that from this last step. So super, super important. And these NADHs and FADH2s that we've made through the other steps are coming to the electron transport chain for the production of ATP. So they've been these batteries that we've been charging that we're going to discharge and try and make ATP with. Okay, let me turn off my camera here so I can use this little animation. Okay, so this is the electron transport chain. Here's the outer mitochondrial membrane. Here's the inner mitochondrial membrane. Now, embedded within the membrane of the mitochondria are a variety of proteins. Now, electrons are going to bounce from protein to protein and try and create a concentration gradient of hydrogen ions. Now, hydrogen on the periodic table is the first one. So it has 1 proton, and when it's uncharged, has 1 electron. And so if it's H+, we really have just protons. H+ is analogous to just a proton. So you might see hydrogen pump, you might see hydrogen ion, hydrogen cation, or protons. Those are all referring to the same thing. Now, remember we have NADHs that we charged in previous steps. We also have FADH2s. We're going to ignore the difference for now. Just assume they function the same way. And we also have oxygen in the form of O2, which is what we and plants both breathe. So O2 here, right? Okay, so NADH2 is going to go to the first protein here, and it's going to split. it's going to break that hydrogen off that we stored it. Remember, we turned NADH plus into NADHs. And so we break that, and now we have NAD, a plus, which can go and get recharged. We have H plus, which now is adding to the hydrogens down here. And we have an electron here. That electron is going to basically turn on that pump. And when it does that, it pumps hydrogens across, usually about 4 hydrogens per pump. It's then going to transfer around through some different things, go to another pump more hydrogens across. It's going to go to cytochrome C here, and then to another pump, and pump more hydrogens across. Now, what's important here is if you look, what's happening is between the 2 mitochondrial membranes are hydrogen ions. Now remember, most things will naturally diffuse from high to low concentrations. So we're creating a really high concentration of hydrogen ions in the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. Now, if there's very few hydrogen ions here and a lot here, these want to diffuse down. They want to go down the concentration gradient into the inner mitochondrial matrix. Now, they can't diffuse through the membrane. And so we have another protein over here that they're going to diffuse through. But before we can do that, we need to get rid of this electron. That's where oxygen comes in. So oxygen is the last electron receptor or acceptor of the electron transport chain. So it's going to take that electron, split the oxygen, which is why we breathe and why plants breathe oxygen, and it's to get that electron off of the electron transport chain. Otherwise, it stops working. And then, as a result of that, because it becomes H negative or O negative, and there's a bunch of H pluses around, we get H2O. So oxygen takes the electron and then gets converted to water with the free hydrogen ions there, which is why we generate water through cellular respiration. So now we've talked about glucose entering glycolysis. We've talked about breathing in oxygen and where that goes. We've talked about production of CO2, production of water, and now it's just production of ATP to complete that equation. So this last part here, this thing here is called ATP synthase. And if you hear this synthase, that ASE on the end, that tells you it's an enzyme. ATP synthase means an enzyme that synthesizes ATP. So remember, we have this concentration gradient of hydrogen ions up here. Now they're going to flow down that ATP synthase, and it's going to cause it to create a bunch of ATP. The way to think about this is to think about like a hydroelectric power plant. Hydroelectric power works by having water up stored in some lake that then it's going to fall down due to gravity and spin some sort of a turbine. The water spinning that turbine, because it's falling down, creates energy for us. It's the same thing here. As the hydrogen ions flow through the enzyme, through the ATP synthase, it's going to spin the protein different. It's more molecular than it is actually like physical turbine, and it creates ATP production. That's where we get that 32 ATP from electron transport chain. Okay, let me turn my camera back on. So we've gone through the entire cellular respiration thing now. We know where glucose goes. It goes to glycolysis, it gets broken down. We break the carbons, slowly breaking them apart, extracting energy. We produce CO2 in pyruvate oxidation in the citric acid cycle, which is what we and plants are going to exhale. We know we breathe in oxygen to get the electron off of that last protein before, so the electron transport chain can function. And we know how we get ATP. So we have all of the steps of cellular respiration there now. Make sure you know all the steps in the detail I explained it there. Now, there's another type of energy production called fermentation. And this is what happens when you don't have oxygen. So what we just talked about was aerobic respiration, respiration in the presence of oxygen. That's what we want to do. But imagine you're sprinting as fast as you can. Eventually you start to fade out, right? And that's because you can't get enough oxygen to your tissues. And there is a different metabolic pathway we can follow. So it begins the same way with glycolysis. Glycolysis still happens. So we have glucose comes in, we produce 2 NADH and 2 ATP net. Remember, because we also use 4 ATP. We convert that to pyruvate. But if we don't have oxygen, we can't get that electron off of the electron transport chain, and the whole system backs up. And so we still want to try and generate energy, but since we don't have oxygen, we can't keep using that. So we stay with glycolysis. So what we do is we take these NADHs and we convert them back to NAD pluses. So we discharge that energy that we saved to convert pyruvate back to lactate, or to lactate. This is why, if you ever heard of lactic acid, and you might have heard that you get sore from lactic acid production, it's actually not why you get sore, but it is a byproduct of exercise that is happening when you don't have enough oxygen present. And so the downside to that is, rather than getting 36 ATP per glucose molecule, you're getting 2, just the 2 from glycolysis. And so it's not sustainable, which is why you can't run long distances at high speed, because you can't make enough energy to actually power that production. Now, there's another type of fermentation, and this is what is more common in plants and also a bunch of other organisms. But you take glucose and you convert it to pyruvate, so the same production, so 2 ATP net, 2 NADH. But then you change it to acetaldehyde, which produces some CO2, and then to ethanol. So we have lactate fermentation. Plants have ethanol or alcohol fermentation. So their fermentation results in alcohol production. Now, they have pretty much the same function in basically minimizing or using ATP, creating ATP when in the lack of oxygen. They just have different byproducts. Okay. So to recap this video, we talked about energy and ATP. We talked about cellular respiration, the 4 stages, where oxygen is used, NADH production, CO2, where glucose goes, how we get the energy, and then the goal of the whole process. And we talked about what happens when we don't have oxygen. So the present, why we go and how we go through the fermentation process.